Hey guys, tonight we begin with, well, what can only be described as a royal mess, literally. So, dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe sip some tea, and let's float back about 2,000 years. We're heading to Rome. And not just any Rome, we're meeting Caligula. Now, if you've ever thought your workplace had terrible management, just remember, ancient Rome had Caligula. This man is often described as one of the most dysfunctional rulers in history, which, when you realize he was competing against an all-star lineup of emperors who poisoned each other, stabbed relatives at dinner, and married their own cousins, well, that's saying something. So, Caligula, born Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, a mouthful, but Romans loved long names. He was the son of Germanicus, a beloved general, and Agrippina the Elder, who basically ran on ambition and spite. Baby Gaius got the nickname Caligula, which means little boot, because as a toddler he ran around in miniature soldier gear. Adorable, right? Until you remember this toddler later ordered executions for sport. But let's not jump ahead. For the first few years of his life, Caligula seemed like the golden child. Cute, smart, the army adored him, Rome adored him, and when he finally took the throne in the year 37 CE, after the death of his adoptive grandfather Tiberius, the city practically threw a parade. Everyone expected greatness. What they got was a slow descent into chaos. Because here's the thing. At first, Caligula started strong. He handed out bonuses to the army, he built public works, he released political prisoners. People were like, wow, he's a refreshing change from Tiberius, who spent most of his later reign soaking on an island and possibly running a very weird seaside dungeon. But then something happened. Some historians say it was an illness, maybe epilepsy, maybe encephality, that hit him in his first year as emperor. Others think it was just the stress of power. Or, being surrounded by scheming senators who'd stab you in the back at brunch if it meant better real estate. Whatever the cause, after that illness, Caligula's personality seemed to do a complete pivot. And by pivot, I mean he started living like a fever dream. Let's start with his spending habits. Caligula inherited a decent treasury. Within a year, he had blown through most of it. Lavish games, massive feasts, chariot races every other weekend. Imagine the world's most spoiled rich kid with unlimited credit cards and a personal coliseum. That's Caligula. He didn't just spend recklessly. He built absurd vanity projects, like a bridge of boats across the Bay of Baie, just so he could ride his horse across it. Because why not? Normal bridges are for peasants. And speaking of his horse, this is where things get interesting. Caligula had a horse named Incitatus, and when I say he loved this horse, I mean he really loved this horse. He gave Incitatus a marble stall, an ivory manger, purple blankets, and even a house with servants. Ancient sources say Caligula planned to make the horse a consul, which sounds insane, but honestly, when you look at Roman politics, a horse might have been an improvement. Of course, Caligula wasn't just quirky with horses. His relationships with people were even worse. He executed senators for fun. He demanded to be worshipped as a living god, going so far as to set up temples to himself. He appeared in public dressed as Jupiter or Venus or Apollo, depending on the mood. Romans were used to a little ego in their emperors, but watching your ruler strut around in golden sandals and the thunderbolt while demanding sacrifices, that's a bit much, even for Rome. Then there were his personal relationships, which can only be described as complicated. He doted on his sisters, perhaps a little too much, if we believe some ancient gossips. He exiled or executed rivals, often on a whim. And he seemed to enjoy making the Senate growl, like inviting them to dinner and then bursting out laughing because they looked uncomfortable. It was like a bad reality show, but with more daggers. Now, we have to pause here, because when you talk about Caligula, it's hard to separate fact from ancient tabloid. The main sources we have, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and Tacitus were not exactly unbiased. Romans loved to spice up their stories. Did Caligula really force senators to kiss his sandals? Did he truly declare war on the sea by ordering his soldiers to stab waves and collect seashells as spoils? Possibly. Or maybe it was just too funny a rumor to leave out. Either way, it stuck. And that's the point with Caligula. Even if only half of the stories are true, he still wins the prize for dysfunction. Imagine being a citizen of Rome, trying to live your daily life, while your emperor is out there declaring himself a god, bankrupting the treasury, threatening to appoint a horse to office, and maybe waging a campaign against Neptune. Not exactly stable leadership. Of course, dysfunctional rulers rarely last long. Caligula's antics eventually pushed everyone, senators, guards, even his own palace staff, over the edge. In the year 41 CE, just 4 years into his reign, he was assassinated in a palace corridor by members of his Praetorian Guard. They didn't even try to make it subtle. Stabbed to death at age 28. And thus ended one of the strangest, shortest, and most chaotic reigns in Roman history. So, what do we learn here? Well, maybe don't spend your entire treasury on boat bridges. Maybe don't declare yourself a living god. And maybe, just maybe, don't threaten to promote your horse, unless you really want your career to end in a palace hallway. But we're just warming up. Because Caligula, as wild as he was hardly the only dysfunctional king history gave us. Let's drift forward to another ruler who made Caligula look almost reasonable. A king whose reign was less ancient sitcom and more ongoing family therapy session that never ended.
Hey guys, still with me? Still comfortable? Good, because we're moving eastward now into the Persian Empire. And if Caligula was Rome's chaotic party boy, then Cambyses II was Persia's walking cautionary tale about what happens when unresolved family issues meet absolute power. So, Cambyses, he was the son of Cyrus the Great. Yes, that Cyrus, the man who built the Persian Empire, conquered Babylon, and generally earned the title the Great the honest way, not the self-proclaimed way. Imagine being the kid of a legend like that. Tough act to follow. Cambyses didn't just inherit an empire, he inherited the expectation of living up to dad's achievements. Spoiler, he did not. When Cyrus died in 530 BCE, Cambyses took the throne. At first, things went okay. He kept the empire stable, didn't instantly collapse under pressure. But then, like many ancient kings, he decided conquest was the best way to prove himself. His target? Egypt. Because why not? Everyone wanted Egypt, the pyramids, the wealth, the Nile, the exotic cats. Persia wanted it too. And here's the thing. Cambyses actually pulled it off. In 525 BCE, he marched into Egypt, defeated Pharaoh Psammetichus III, and claimed Egypt as part of the Persian Empire, which should have been a major win. He could have stopped there, gone home, and earned at least a Cambyses the Pretty Decent. But no, that would have been too easy. Instead, once in Egypt, Cambyses seemed to unravel. Ancient sources, mostly Herodotus, who never missed a chance to dramatize, describe him as sliding into full dysfunction. Was it stress? Was it madness? Or was it just the ancient world's way of making rulers look unhinged? Hard to say. But the stories are something. For example, there's the tale of Cambyses mocking Egyptian religion. He supposedly laughed at their gods, stabbed sacred statues, and even killed the Apis bull, a holy animal the Egyptians worshipped, which, if true, was basically the worst PR move possible. Imagine showing up in a new country, announcing yourself as their ruler, and then immediately kicking their spiritual mascot. Not a smooth strategy. And then there were his personal decisions. Cambyses, like Caligula, seemed to enjoy making his relatives miserable. Some accounts say he married his own sisters, which sure, wasn't unheard of in certain dynasties, but still not exactly a sign of stable governance. He also allegedly killed his brother, Smerdis, out of paranoia. He thought Smerdis might try to take the throne, so instead of handling it diplomatically, he just eliminated him. But the problem with paranoia is it doesn't stop once you act on it. After killing Smerdis, Cambyses became even more unstable. He started seeing conspiracies everywhere. Executions multiplied. Egypt, instead of becoming a proud new jewel of the empire, turned into the stage for Cambyses' personal meltdown. And then came the ill-fated military campaigns. Oh yes, because one conquest wasn't enough. Cambyses decided to push further, into Nubia, into Carthage, into basically anywhere the map wasn't already colored Persian green. The trouble was, logistics weren't on his side. One army he sent towards Carthage never even got going because the Phoenician fleet, who were supposed to help, refused. They didn't want to attack their own kin. Fair enough. Another army he sent towards the Oracle of Ammon in the desert? Gone. Completely. According to legend, 50,000 men disappeared into the sands, swallowed by a storm, which might be exaggerated, but still, it doesn't scream strategic genius. It screams man with no GPS. By this point, Cambyses' reign was less about empire building and more about slow-motion self-destruction, and fate decided to wrap it up in the most anticlimactic way possible. Around 522 BCE, while returning from Egypt, Cambyses supposedly injured himself. Accounts differ. Some say he accidentally stabbed his thigh while mounting his horse. Others say it was an infection, or maybe just karma. Either way, he died. Just like that. The son of Cyrus the Great, undone by bad luck and worse decisions. So what do we make of Cambyses II? Dysfunctional? Absolutely. He had everything, a vast empire, the legacy of one of history's greatest kings, and he squandered it in paranoia, rash campaigns, and religious blunders. If Caligula's reign was a circus, Cambyses was a slow-motion tragedy, both in the same way, with everyone around them breathing a sigh of relief when it was finally over. And yet, there's something almost comforting in knowing that even in the grandeur of ancient Persia, with palaces, armies, and wealth beyond measure, you could still have a ruler who basically tripped over his own paranoia until it killed him. Let's float now to another royal disaster, one who makes Cambyses' paranoia look almost cute. A man who believed he was Hercules reborn, but couldn't keep his empire from falling apart the second he left the room. You know him. You've heard the name. And yes, his story is coming up next.
Hey guys, still awake? Maybe barely. That's perfect, because now we're going to talk about one of history's most famous overachievers, who was also, let's be honest, kind of a walking bundle of unresolved therapy sessions. Yes, Alexander the Great, or as I like to call him, Alexander the Dad Issues. Born in 356 BCE, Alexander was the son of Philip II of Macedonia, who basically turned Macedonia from a backwater into the rising powerhouse of Greece. Philip was a brilliant military strategist, endlessly ambitious, and, inconveniently, very good at conquering things, which set the bar for his son at a truly unreasonable height. Oh, and Philip also had a wandering eye when it came to marriages and mistresses, and, really, anything that could complicate family life. Meanwhile, Alexander's mother Olympias was, how shall we put this? Intense, passionate, political, probably terrifying. She filled young Alexander's head with stories of his divine heritage, insisting he was descended from Achilles and maybe even Zeus, which sounds flattering at first. But imagine being a teenager told daily that you're basically the chosen son of the gods. That does things to your ego. So, between a dad who overshadowed him and a mom who overinflated him, Alexander grew up with one of the most toxic parent combos in history. It's no wonder he developed into both a brilliant military leader and a catastrophically dysfunctional human being. Now, credit where it's due,
Alexander was a genius on the battlefield. By the time he was 20, his father had been assassinated, awkward family dinners, I imagine, and Alexander took the throne. Most rulers would have taken a few years to settle in, secure their kingdom, maybe enjoy a quiet summer. Not Alexander. He launched straight into conquering the known world. Because moderation was never really his thing. And conquer he did. Persia, Egypt, parts of India, you name it, Alexander marched through it. His empire stretched from Greece all the way to the Indus River. People call him one of the greatest military minds of all time, and they're not wrong. But here's where the dysfunction really shows. For Alexander, conquest wasn't just strategy, it was therapy. It was how he dealt with insecurity, grief, and an ego the size of his empire. Take his relationship with drinking, for example. Alexander didn't just enjoy wine, he bathed in it, metaphorically, sometimes literally. He once got so drunk that he killed one of his closest friends, Cletus the Black, in a fit of rage. Cletus, by the way, had saved Alexander's life in battle. Small detail. But one insult too many, one cup of wine too many, and Alexander's temper snapped. The next morning, crushing guilt. He wept, mourned, begged for forgiveness from a man who was now inconveniently very dead. Classic dysfunctional cycle. Then there were the identity issues. Alexander increasingly believed he was not just a great general, but actually divine. He demanded that his men treat him as a god, which, if you're trying to run an empire full of people already annoyed that you conquered them, is a bold move. He even adopted Persian court customs like proskynesis, the act of bowing down before him. Greeks hated it. His soldiers grumbled. But Alexander doubled down because once your mom convinces you Zeus is your real dad, humility isn't really in the cards. And let's not forget the paranoia. Toward the end of his reign, Alexander trusted no one. Plots, real or imagined, were everywhere. He executed officers, friends, even allies who had once been his greatest supporters. The bigger his empire got, the smaller his circle of trust became. It's like the ancient world's worst episode of Survivor. And yet, underneath the ego, the rage, the paranoia, was still that young kid from Macedonia trying desperately to outdo his father. Every campaign, every city named after himself. Yes, he founded over 20 Alexandrias because modesty was not in his vocabulary, was part of that lifelong obsession with legacy. Of course, it all ended the same way it often does for dysfunctional kings. In 323 BCE, at just 32 years old, Alexander died in Babylon. Theories range from poisoning to malaria to just his body finally giving out after years of exhaustion and heart living. Whatever the cause, his ended death left his empire immediately fractured, carved up by generals who had been smiling to his face while sharpening knives behind his back. So, what's the bedtime takeaway? Alexander conquered the world but couldn't conquer himself. Brilliant tactician, unstoppable general, but at his core, a young man who never escaped the shadow of his father and the manipulations of his mother. Dysfunctional? Oh, absolutely. He embodied it. And now, let's drift gently from one empire to another. From Greece and Persia, we'll float to the sands of Egypt. Because if Alexander was dysfunctional in life, then the pharaohs were dysfunctional in pretty much everything, from their marriages to their gods to their personal grooming habits. Hey friends, still awake? Or maybe halfway drifting? That's fine, because now we're entering the world of Egypt, where rulers sat on thrones shaped like golden lions, claimed they were literal gods, and also married their sisters. Yeah. Welcome to the pharaohs. Now, in fairness,
Egypt wasn't unique in its weird dynastic traditions. Lots of royal families enjoyed recycling their family trees like broken spaghetti. But Egypt? Egypt elevated it to an art form. If you were a pharaoh, the idea of marrying someone outside the family was practically scandalous. After all, if you're a living god on earth, why would you taint your bloodline with some ordinary noble? No, better to just marry your sister, or your half-sister, or occasionally your daughter. Because nothing says eternal dynasty quite like making family reunions into wedding receptions. Take Akhenaten, for example. This was the guy who decided one day that Egypt should ditch all its many gods, Ra, Osiris, Anubis, the whole crew, and worship just one, Aten, the sun disk. Sounds like a bold theological reform, right? Sure. Except he also married his sister, Nefertiti, and then possibly married one of his daughters too, which makes family dinners at Amarna sound less like divine banquets and more like awkward soap operas. And then there's Tutankhamun, the so-called Boy King. His fame today comes mostly from that shiny golden mask discovered in his tomb. But behind the glitter, Tut was basically a tragic medical case study in inbreeding. His parents were siblings, which explains why Tut himself was frail, riddled with health problems, and likely had a club foot. So much for the godlike image. He could barely stand upright without assistance. Yet still, Egyptians worshipped him as the divine ruler of the Nile. It's one of those ironic contrasts, isn't it? On temple walls, he's shown as a towering warrior smiting enemies with his mace. In reality, he probably couldn't have jogged across the room without collapsing. The gods, it seems, had a sense of humor. Now, dysfunction in Egypt wasn't just genetic, it was political too. Because when your rulers think they're gods, accountability becomes tricky. Pharaohs could decree pretty much anything, and everyone else just had to nod politely. Want to build a pyramid that takes 30 years, thousands of lives, and half the country's resources? Sure, why not? You're divine. We'll get right on that. Of course, sometimes this god-king thing backfired. Hatshepsut, one of the few female pharaohs, had to spend her reign convincing everyone she was just as legitimate as any man, which she did by, quite literally, commissioning statues of herself with the fake beard. Because nothing screams royal authority like cosplay facial hair carved in granite. And let's not forget Ramses II. He ruled for over 60 years, fought a lot of wars, built a lot of temples, and fathered allegedly over 100 children, which sounds less like divine glory and more like a pharaoh who never figured out what birth control was. Imagine the inheritance paperwork. Dysfunctional? Yes. Legendary? Also yes. Even death didn't free Egyptian rulers from drama. Their elaborate burials were designed to preserve their souls forever, but they also painted giant targets on their tombs. Grave robbing became almost a national pastime. So while inscriptions promised eternal rest, reality meant your carefully mummified body might end up looted, scattered, or shoved into a secondary tomb like a piece of unwanted furniture. But perhaps the most ironic dysfunction was this. Pharaohs insisted they were gods, embodiments of order and stability. Yet their dynasties were riddled with chaos, rivalry, and collapse. Each golden throne came with a countdown timer. No matter how high they built their monuments, time and family politics pulled it all down again. So what do we take away here? The Egyptians perfected the art of divine kingship, but their rulers were still very human, dysfunctional, insecure, sometimes sickly, often paranoid. In other words, gods who couldn't escape being people. Let's drift now, slowly from the banks of the Nile back toward the Mediterranean. Because while Egyptian pharaohs were busy inbreeding, another kingdom was making dysfunction its national brand. That's right. We're heading into the world of ancient Rome, where emperors made Egypt look like a model of stability. Hey again, still with me? If you've drifted off already, that's fine. But if you're awake, grab your metaphorical toga and settle in, because now we're heading to Rome, land of aqueducts, bread, circuses, and emperors who thought poisoning your relatives was a reasonable weekend hobby. Rome is funny in this way. The empire loved to brag about its order and laws. The Pax Romana, the glory of the legions, the brilliance of Roman engineering. And yet, when it came to emperors, things were often a lot less stable. The official job description for emperor basically read, must be paranoid, enjoy betrayal, and have a flair for bizarre decision-making. Bonus points if you think you're a god. Take Caligula, probably the poster child for dysfunctional emperors. He started out promising, young, and charismatic. The people loved him. Then, well, something happened. Maybe illness, maybe power, maybe just genetics. But before long, Caligula was making his horse a senator. Yes, literally. The horse had a marble stable and probably better living conditions than half the Roman population. It's the ancient equivalent of appointing your pet goldfish to the Supreme Court. And that's not even the strangest part. Caligula liked to host dinners where he'd casually remind guests that he could have them executed at any moment. Fun conversation starter. Imagine sitting there, nervously chewing your roasted dormouse while the emperor smirks and points out that your head would look great on a pike. Sleepy vibes, right? Then came Nero. If Caligula was eccentric, Nero was a full-blown diva. He fancied himself a great artist, which sounds fine, except he was emperor of Rome, not a struggling theater kid. Still, he forced senators and nobles to attend his endless musical performances. Imagine being trapped for hours while Nero strummed the lyre and sang off-key, and you had to clap like your life depended on it. Because it did. Nero also gets blamed for fiddling while Rome burned. Whether or not that's strictly true, it fits the vibe. His solution to the Great Fire? Built himself an enormous golden palace over the ruins. Because when half your capital city is ash, the natural response is, of course, more marble fountains, please. And then there's Commodus. You might know him from the movie Gladiator, the one with Joaquin Phoenix looking smug. Real-life Commodus wasn't much better. He loved the Colosseum so much that he performed there himself. Not as a spectator, as a gladiator. The Emperor of Rome literally cosplayed as a fighter in staged battles. Of course, his opponents weren't allowed to hurt him, which made his victories less impressive and more like a child insisting he won tag. But the crowds clapped anyway, because, well, death penalties aren't fun. Rome's emperors often lived in fear too. Paranoia was practically a job requirement. If you weren't murdered by your bodyguards, poisoned by your wife, or overthrown by your own general, then frankly, you weren't trying hard enough. The phrase et tu brute sums it all up. Even Julius Caesar, before the empire officially began, learned that being too powerful in Rome made you more stab-worthy than beloved. And let's not overlook the everyday absurdities. Emperors declared themselves gods. They built statues of themselves towering over temples. They renamed months of the year after themselves. Because nothing says humility like deciding August should literally be called Augustus. But behind all the grandiose marble and imperial decrees, Rome's dysfunction boiled down to fragile egos and purple robes. One bad decision, one paranoid outburst, and the entire empire felt it. Legions marched, provinces revolted, heads rolled, sometimes literally. So yes, Rome gave us aqueducts, roads, and law codes, but it also gave us leaders who thought sibling murder, public singing, and horse promotions were acceptable governance strategies. Dysfunction wrapped in a toga. Now, let's float gently away from the roar of the Colosseum, because if Rome was chaos, then what came next was pure theater. We're heading east to Byzantium, where emperors managed to keep Rome's traditions alive, especially the dysfunctional ones. Hey again, still with me? If you've drifted off already, that's fine. But if you're awake, grab your metaphorical toga and settle in, because now we're heading to Rome, land of aqueducts, bread, circuses, and emperors who thought poisoning your relatives was a reasonable weekend hobby. Rome is funny in this way. The empire loved to brag about its order and laws. The Pax Romana, the glory of the legions, the brilliance of Roman engineering. And yet, when it came to emperors, things were often a lot less stable. The official job description for emperor basically read, must be paranoid, enjoy betrayal, and have a flair for bizarre decision-making. Bonus points if you think you're a god. Take Caligula, probably the poster child for dysfunctional emperors. He started out promising, young, and charismatic. The people loved him. Then, well, something happened. Maybe illness, maybe power, maybe just genetics. But before long, Caligula was making his horse a senator. Yes, literally. The horse had a marble stable and probably better living conditions than half the Roman population. It's the ancient equivalent of appointing your pet goldfish to the Supreme Court. And that's not even the strangest part. Caligula liked to host dinners where he'd casually remind guests that he could have them executed at any moment. Fun conversation starter. Imagine sitting there, nervously chewing your roasted dormouse while the emperor smirks and points out that your head would look great on a pike. Sleepy vibes, right? Then came Nero. If Caligula was eccentric, Nero was a full-blown diva. He fancied himself a great artist, which sounds fine, except he was emperor of Rome, not a struggling theater kid. Still, he forced senators and nobles to attend his endless musical performances. Imagine being trapped for hours while Nero strummed the lyre and sang off-key, and you had to clap like your life depended on it. Because it did. Nero also gets blamed for fiddling while Rome burned. Whether or not that's strictly true, it fits the vibe. His solution to the Great Fire? Built himself an enormous golden palace over the ruins. Because when half your capital city is ash, the natural response is, of course, more marble fountains, please. And then there's Commodus. You might know him from the movie Gladiator, the one with Joaquin Phoenix looking smug. Real-life Commodus wasn't much better. He loved the Colosseum so much that he performed there himself. Not as a spectator, as a gladiator. The Emperor of Rome literally cosplayed as a fighter in staged battles. Of course, his opponents weren't allowed to hurt him, which made his victories less impressive and more like a child insisting he won tag. But the crowds clapped anyway, because, well, death penalties aren't fun. Rome's emperors often lived in fear too. Paranoia was practically a job requirement. If you weren't murdered by your bodyguards, poisoned by your wife, or overthrown by your own general, then frankly, you weren't trying hard enough. The phrase et tu, brute, sums it all up. Even Julius Caesar, before the empire officially began, learned that being too powerful in Rome made you more stab-worthy than beloved. And let's not overlook the everyday absurdities. Emperors declared themselves gods. They built statues of themselves towering over temples. They renamed months of the year after themselves. Because nothing says humility like deciding August should literally be called Augustus. But behind all the grandiose marble and imperial decrees, Rome's dysfunction boiled down to fragile egos and purple robes. One bad decision, one paranoid outburst, and the entire empire felt it. Legions marched, provinces revolted, heads rolled, sometimes literally. So, yes, Rome gave us aqueducts, roads, and law codes, but it also gave us leaders who thought sibling murder, public singing, and horse promotions were acceptable governance strategies. Dysfunction wrapped in a toga. Now, let's float gently away from the roar of the Colosseum, because if Rome was chaos, then what came next was pure theater. We're heading east to Byzantium, where emperors managed to keep Rome's traditions alive, especially the dysfunctional ones.
Hey again. If you're still awake, congratulations. If you're half asleep, that's even better. Tonight, we're going to take a soft little glide over to Byzantium. You know, the Eastern Roman Empire. The one that survived 1,000 years longer than the Western version, but somehow managed to keep all the political drama, backstabbing, and paranoia alive. Consistency is important. Byzantine emperors loved two things: gold mosaics and conspiracy theories. They lived in the lavish palace at Constantinople, a maze of gilded halls, gardens, and secret passageways, which was perfect because half the time someone was plotting to overthrow them. If Rome's emperors were flamboyant, the Byzantines were suspicious. Very suspicious. Let's start with Justinian II. He ruled in the 7th century, and honestly, he should have been remembered for great things. He rebuilt the empire, minted fancy coins, all that. But instead, he's remembered as the guy who lost his nose. Yes, in one of those very Byzantine moments when his enemies overthrew him, they didn't kill him. They just chopped off his nose and sent him into exile. Because apparently, in Byzantine logic, a man without a nose couldn't be emperor. Except Justinian didn't agree. He came back with a golden prosthetic nose. Imagine it, a furious emperor, gleaming metal strapped to his face, marching into Constantinople to reclaim the throne. Which he did, not once, but twice. Dysfunctional? Absolutely. Determined? Also yes. And very shiny. Then we have Basil the Bulgar Slayer. Sounds like a cool video game character, but in reality, he was less heroic and more intense. He earned his nickname after defeating the Bulgars and supposedly blinding 15,000 prisoners of war. A charming bedtime story, I know. Basil was obsessed with discipline, both for his enemies and his court. He never married, he barely smiled, and he basically lived like a grumpy monk with the crown. Dysfunction doesn't always mean chaotic. It can also mean being so terrifyingly strict that no one wants to sit next to you at dinner. And then there was Michael III, also known as Michael the Drunkard, a nickname that tells you everything you need to know. He preferred taverns to governing, and instead of running an empire, he threw parties. Of course, parties in Constantinople weren't exactly harmless. At one point, he staged mock religious ceremonies with his drinking buddies, dressing animals as bishops. Somehow, this was considered hilarious at the time. His courtiers laughed nervously. The patriarch of Constantinople probably less so. Eventually, Michael's reign ended the way many Byzantine stories do: betrayal and assassination. Maybe too many awkward drinking games. And of course, we can't skip the palace coups. The Byzantine throne was less hereditary monarchy and more musical chairs with knives.
Empress Irene, for instance, ruled in the 8th century. She loved power so much that when her son grew up and tried to take over, she had him blinded permanently. He died not long after. So yes, technically, Byzantium had its first female emperor because Irene decided motherhood had an expiration date. What's interesting is how normal all of this was in Byzantium. The average emperor lasted about 7 years before being assassinated, exiled, or replaced. People accepted it the way we accept a new phone update every fall. Another emperor, another palace coup, sure, why not? And all of this was happening against a backdrop of grandeur. The Hagia Sophia with its glowing domes, processions where emperors wore robes so heavy with jewels that they needed help walking, public ceremonies so staged and elaborate you'd think they were choreographed Broadway productions. But behind the glitter, there was always paranoia. Who's plotting against me? My generals? My family? The guy serving my wine? Probably all of the above. The Byzantines even had a special group of soldiers, the Varangian Guard, big, burly warriors, often from Scandinavia, whose job was to protect the emperor. They were loyal, but also intimidating. Picture a hall full of 6-foot-tall Vikings in shiny armor glaring at anyone who looked suspicious, which in Byzantium meant basically everyone. So the Byzantine emperors carried on the fine Roman tradition of dysfunction. Some drank too much, some ruled with an iron fist, some lost their noses, and some blinded their own children. But through all of that, the empire survived for 1,000 years. Maybe dysfunction, oddly enough, was the secret ingredient. Now, let's drift quietly away from Constantinople's golden domes, because next we're heading somewhere different, to the far reaches of the East, where dynasties rose and emperors reigned with their own unique blend of brilliance and chaos. Yes, it's time for the Chinese emperors. Dysfunction, now with silk robes.
Hey again. If you've made it this far, you're either deeply into history or very close to sleep. Either way, that's exactly where you should be. Tonight, we're leaving the marble columns of Byzantium and stepping through the vermilion gates of imperial China, the land of mandarins, dynasties, and emperors who managed to turn family squabbles into actual national crises. Now, Chinese dynasties loved the idea of the mandate of heaven. It was this cosmic permission slip from the gods that said, yes, you may rule. If things went wrong, floods, plagues, rebellions, that meant heaven had revoked the slip. And what's the fastest way to lose divine approval? Well, being extremely dysfunctional, which conveniently for us was a recurring imperial hobby. Let's start with Emperor Qi Shi Huang. You know, the terracotta army guy, the first emperor of a unified China. Brilliant strategist, obsessed with immortality. And when I say obsessed, I mean he drank mercury potions because some sketchy alchemists promised eternal life. Spoiler, it didn't work. But it did slowly destroy his body and mind. So the man who built an empire and the Great Wall also died chasing snake oil remedies. Dysfunctional? Definitely. Ironically tragic? Absolutely. Next, Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty. Ambitious, clever, but also paranoid. He ruled for decades, expanding the empire. But as he got older, he became convinced everyone was plotting against him. Courtiers, generals, his own family. He executed people left and right. At one point, he accused his beloved concubine of witchcraft, because apparently, if your stomach hurt, it must be sorcery. To be fair, ancient emperors weren't exactly checking WebMD. Then there was Emperor Yang of the Sui dynasty.
This man was peak dysfunctional. He loved luxury, palaces, and canals. He forced millions of peasants to work on his construction projects, which was exhausting and, well, deadly. While they collapsed in the mud, he threw extravagant parties with mountains of food. Eventually, the peasants rebelled, which shocked him because apparently, after being worked to death, people don't feel festive. Who knew? But if we're talking true dysfunction, we have to talk about the Ming Dynasty, specifically the Wanli Emperor. He started strong, full of energy. Then one day, he just stopped showing up. For almost 20 years, he refused to attend government meetings. Ministers begged him, petitioned him, wrote long scrolls of complaints. His response? Silence. Wan Li spent his time in the palace, eating, drinking, and sulking about court politics. Imagine a head of state ghosting his entire government for 2 decades. Very on-brand dysfunction. And then there's the Qing dynasty, with its palace full of drama. Emperors had hundreds of concubines, dozens of children, and way too many in-laws. This made family life complicated. Fights over succession turned brothers into enemies. One prince might accuse another of treason. Another might try to sneak letters to powerful eunuchs. The Forbidden City, with its elegant courtyards, was basically the world's fanciest soap opera set. Speaking of eunuchs, they deserve a whole aside. These palace officials often ended up running things behind the scenes. Some emperors relied on them completely, others hated them. But one thing's certain, eunuchs loved intrigue. They whispered, schemed, and played factions against each other. And every time, the emperor was in the middle, sometimes completely clueless. Dysfunction wasn't just personal, it was built into the palace system. Of course, there were also emperors like Guangxu who wanted reform but couldn't act without his aunt, the Empress Dowager Cixi, overruling him. She was a master of palace politics. At one point, she literally had Guangxu confined to a small island within the Forbidden City. Imagine ruling in name while your aunt keeps you grounded like a teenager who missed curfew. Dysfunction, but with silk robes and dragon thrones. And through all this, life in the Forbidden City looks serene from the outside. Gold roofs glimmering in the sun, courtyards swept clean, officials bowing low as the emperor passed. But behind those red walls, family feuds, suspicious deaths, and emperors who sometimes preferred wine, poetry, or complete avoidance over actual governing. So yes, the Chinese emperors were glorious, powerful, and divinely appointed, but they were also deeply human, which meant bouts of paranoia, stubbornness, laziness, and bad medical advice. And somehow, the empire kept going, dynasty after dynasty, each one swearing they'd avoid the mistakes of the last, and each one proving that dysfunction was practically part of the job description. Now, let's leave the Forbidden City quietly behind. We've wandered its courtyards long enough. Next, we'll drift southward into the world of the pharaohs, ancient Egypt, pyramids, golden masks, and rulers who often turned out to be more fragile than their monuments. Dysfunction, wrapped in linen.
Hey guys, welcome back. We've left behind the red walls of the Forbidden City, and now we're standing by the Nile. You can almost hear the river flowing in the dark. Ancient Egypt looks so stable, so eternal. The pyramids don't move, the Sphinx stares forever, but inside the palaces, chaos, drama, family dysfunction that makes modern reality TV look tame. So, let's settle in, get cozy, and take a long, slow drift through the strange world of Egyptian pharaohs. Let's start with Akhenaten, pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. He's remembered as the guy who tried to invent a brand new religion, which, in Egypt, was kind of a big deal. Everyone was perfectly fine with the hundreds of gods they already had. Falcon-headed ones, crocodile-headed ones, you name it. But Akhenaten, no. He decided all of that was out. Instead, he wanted everyone to worship just the sun disk, the Aten. He shut down temples, erased names of old gods, and even moved the capital to a brand new city. All of this because he was, let's be honest, a little obsessed. His statues show him with an elongated head, narrow face, strange body proportions. Scholars still argue if he was sick or just styled differently. Either way, he was convinced he was chosen by Aten. Meanwhile, the priests were furious, the people were confused, and his government probably wanted him to chill. Dysfunction, Ancient Egyptian edition. Now, his wife, Nefertiti, often shows up in the story, famous for her beauty, of course, but also for possibly ruling alongside him. After Akhenaten's death, things got even murkier. Did Nefertiti take the throne? Did she become a female pharaoh? Or did she disappear mysteriously? No one really knows. Egyptian palace life was like that, half political chaos, half missing persons mystery. And then came Tutankhamun. Yes, the boy king with the golden mask. He was probably Akhenaten's son, or maybe his son-in-law. Again, family trees here look like tangled papyrus scrolls. Took the throne at age 9. Imagine a fourth grader being king. Naturally, older advisors ran things for him. The dysfunction was in the background. Power struggles, priests undoing Akhenaten's reforms, generals maneuvering for control. Tut himself didn't live long. He died around 18 or 19, likely from a mix of inbreeding, health issues, and maybe an accident. His famous tomb is impressive, but his reign was short, fragile, and sad. A teenage pharaoh caught in a web of adult dysfunction. But Egypt's most famous dysfunctional dynasty, the Ptolemies, Greek rulers who took over after Alexander the Great. They lived in Egypt, ruled as pharaohs, but brought a new tradition with them. Family drama so intense it could power 10 seasons of a soap opera. Take Ptolemy II. He married his sister. Not uncommon in Egypt, but still eyebrow-raising. His nickname was Philadelphus, which means sibling loving. Yes, exactly that. His court was full of luxury, feasts, and intellectuals. He loved poets. He also loved making sure his family tree looked more like a wreath. Fast forward to Cleopatra's family. Dysfunctional doesn't even begin to cover it. Brothers marrying sisters, siblings plotting to murder each other, civil wars inside palaces. Cleopatra herself had to fight her own brother husband, Ptolemy XIII, for the throne. At one point, he literally tried to kill her, and she snuck out of the palace rolled up in a carpet. Subtle? No. Effective? Yes. Dysfunctional? Off the charts. Cleopatra, of course, is remembered for her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. But honestly, those were just the highlights. Her real struggle was surviving her own family. Ptolemies were like the Kardashians if everyone had a personal army and poison jars lying around. Now, back to earlier dynasties for a moment. Pharaoh Ramses II, the Great, lived for over 90 years, which for the ancient world was almost suspiciously long. He had over 100 children, dozens of wives, and countless concubines, which sounds powerful until you realize it created a nightmare succession situation. His descendants spent generations arguing over the throne. Basically, by having too many heirs, he guaranteed dysfunction for centuries. A dynasty turned into one long family squabble. Another case is Hatshepsut, the queen who became pharaoh. She wore false beards, dressed in men's regalia, and built giant temples. She ruled successfully, but after her death, her successor tried to erase her name from history, literally chiseling it off monuments. Ancient cancel culture. Dysfunction, but carved in stone. And then there's the daily palace life. Court eunuchs whispering advice, priests tugging at royal ears, foreign envoys watching all the drama. Behind the golden thrones, things were never calm. Pharaohs were supposed to be gods, divine, perfect, eternal. In reality, they were fragile, paranoid,
and often surrounded by scheming relatives. The strangest part? Egyptians went along with it, because to them, the pharaoh wasn't just a man. He was Horus in human form. If he was dysfunctional, well, that was just part of the cosmic order. Floods came, harvests grew, temples stood tall. Meanwhile, inside the palace, siblings plotted, rulers panicked, and royal children carried the burden of divine family drama. So, when we look at Egypt today, its pyramids, temples, and golden treasures, we see stability, eternity carved in stone. But behind the facade was a constant hum of dysfunction. Pharaohs who thought they were gods, but lived and failed like humans. And now, let's drift away from the Nile. We'll leave the pyramids in the moonlight, the temples silent under the stars. Ahead lies another land of kings and dysfunction, this time in India. Palaces, courts, and emperors who made drama a fine art.
Hey guys, welcome back. The pyramids are behind us. The Nile fades into the background. And now we're surrounded by the humid night air of India. Crickets hum. Somewhere in the distance, a sitar plays. And inside the palace walls, arguments about succession, betrayals at family dinners, and rulers who sometimes spent more time scheming against their brothers than ruling their kingdoms. So, let's take a slow walk into the marble quarters of India's royal past. We'll start with one of the most famous dysfunctional dynasties, the Mughals. Their founder, Babur, came down from Central Asia, a descendant of both Genghis Khan and Tamerlane, because apparently he won the genetic lottery for chaotic conqueror ancestors. Babur carved out a foothold in India, but spent a lot of time writing in his diary about how he missed melons from Samarkand. Very relatable, but also very dysfunctional for a conqueror. Imagine being a warlord and still whining about produce. His grandson, Akbar the Great, is often remembered as wise, tolerant, and deeply impressive. And yes, he was. He expanded the empire massively, but he was also illiterate, couldn't read a word. Instead, he had books read to him every night, like bedtime stories for an emperor, which honestly is pretty charming. Still, Akbar's court was filled with intrigue. Multiple wives, endless advisors, and rival sons all competing for his attention. Dysfunction wrapped in imperial grandeur. And then came Jahangir, Akbar's son, a man who loved art, gardens, and opium. Lots of it. He wrote an autobiography where he casually mentioned being high most of the time. His wife, Noor Jahan, ended up running the empire while Jahangir floated somewhere between intoxication and paranoia. Dysfunction, Mughal style. An empire technically ruled by a man too busy relaxing in his garden with a pipe to notice. Then there was Shah Jahan, the guy who built the Taj Mahal. Beautiful, eternal, romantic. Except the love story had its tragic twist. After his wife, Mumtaz Mahal, died giving birth to their 14th child, yes, 14, he spent years mourning and built the most extravagant tomb in history, which sounds sweet, but meanwhile the empire strained under the cost and his children began circling like vultures. Dysfunction hid behind the marble. That leads us to his son, Aurangzeb, a strict, pious ruler who rolled back many of Akbar's tolerant policies. He locked up his father in a fort, leaving Shah Jahan to spend his last years gazing at the Taj Mahal from a distance. Family values at their finest. Aurangzeb fought his brothers in a brutal war of succession because apparently in the Mughal world, the throne was less inherited and more violently wrestled from your siblings. Dysfunction wasn't an accident. It was the system.
Hey friends, welcome back. Tonight, our bedtime tour of royal disasters drifts westward into the shadowy castles and damp halls of medieval Europe. You might expect noble knights, glorious crusades, and kings ruling with wisdom and bravery. But no, what you get instead are rulers who were paranoid, incompetent, frequently broke, and sometimes just outright ridiculous. So let's relax into it, because medieval dysfunction has its own sleepy charm. We'll start with King John of England. Yes, that King John, the villain from Robin Hood, forever remembered as greedy, cowardly, and cruel. And to be fair, that reputation is mostly accurate. He lost huge chunks of land in France, taxed his barons into open rebellion, and managed to get himself excommunicated by the Pope, which honestly is quite an achievement for a king. Eventually, his barons forced him to sign the Magna Carta in 1215, basically a royal, you can't keep doing this, contract. Dysfunction level, high. Legacy, he's still known as one of England's worst kings. Now, if you thought John was bad, let's peek at Charles VI of France, known as Charles the Mad. And not in a cute, eccentric way. He had genuine, debilitating bouts of mental illness. Sometimes he thought he was made of glass, which led him to wrap himself in blankets and refuse to move for fear of shattering. Other times, he ran screaming through the palace halls. France, already in chaos during the Hundred Years' War, had to somehow keep functioning with a king who thought he was basically fine china. His courtiers would carefully touch him to reassure him he wasn't actually glass. Dysfunction at its most delicate. And then there's Edward II of England. His reign was, let's say, complicated. He alienated the nobility by showering wealth and power on his favorites, particularly Piers Gaveston, which sparked endless resentment. His military skills? Not great. At the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, he managed to lose catastrophically to the Scots, solidifying his reputation as incompetent. Eventually, his wife Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer invaded England, forced Edward to abdicate, and, well, his end was not pleasant. Dysfunction in this case ended with the king himself being unceremoniously pushed aside. We can't talk dysfunction without mentioning Henry VI of England, a gentle, deeply pious man. Too gentle, in fact, for the brutal politics of the Wars of the Roses. He would slip into catatonic states for months, unable to speak or recognize anyone, leaving the kingdom in chaos. Meanwhile, rival factions tore England apart, all while Henry quietly prayed and occasionally forgot he was even king. Dysfunction at its sleepiest. Then there's Richard II, a king who believed in absolute authority but lacked the charisma or strength to back it up. He alienated nobles, picked fights he couldn't win, and generally acted like a medieval teenager trapped in a crown. His downfall came when his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, returned from exile, deposed him, and took the throne. Richard ended up imprisoned and likely starved to death. Dysfunction rating, petulant child with a scepter. Over in Germany, we have Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia, nicknamed the Lazy, which is not a great look for a monarch. He preferred drinking, hunting, and lounging over ruling. At one point, he was actually captured by his own nobles who had had enough of his incompetence. When your own subjects lock you up because you can't be bothered to do your job, that's medieval dysfunction at its finest. And what about the Crusades? Oh yes, dysfunction galore. Louis IX of France may have been saintly, but he also bankrupted his kingdom on failed crusades. Richard the Lionheart is remembered as a warrior king, but he spent so little time in England that people barely knew him. His brother John, meanwhile, botched everything at home. Dysfunction ran in the family. In Castile, Peter the Cruel, or Peter the Just, depending on who you asked, lived up to his nickname. His reign was marked by feuds, murders, and constant civil war. He personally executed nobles and even family members. A king who treated his throne like a personal vendetta machine. Dysfunction, bloody, and personal. And then there's Charles II of Navarre, also known as Charles the Bad. His hobbies included poisoning people and plotting betrayals. He switched sides constantly during the Hundred Years' War, and nobody trusted him. In fact, he was so hated that when he died, people didn't mourn, they celebrated. Dysfunctional to the very end. If you notice a theme here, it's that medieval kingship was less about steady leadership and more about surviving constant chaos. Many of these kings weren't chosen for their skills. They were simply born into it. Some couldn't handle the pressure. Some abused it. Some just weren't cut out for ruling at all. So when we think of medieval Europe with its castles and knights, we can imagine kings sitting proudly on their thrones. But in reality, many were fumbling through, plagued by incompetence, madness, or sheer laziness. Dysfunction, dressed in ermine and sitting beneath stained glass windows. Let's drift now toward the twilight of this long parade of royal misfortune, because next we're heading into the Renaissance, a world of art, beauty, and innovation, mixed with some of the most scandalous royal personalities of all.
Hey again. If you've made it this far, congratulations. You floated through pharaohs, emperors, maharajas, and medieval kings. Now, let's drift gently into Renaissance Europe, where the art was beautiful, the architecture breathtaking, and the royal scandals sometimes deadly. We'll start with Lorenzo de' Medici, the Magnificent, Florence's golden boy, patron of the arts, lover of poetry and sculpture. A brilliant mind, but also a man deeply entangled in political intrigue. Lorenzo had to balance factions, bribe allies, and occasionally dodge assassination attempts. Dysfunction here isn't about personal failings as much as the sheer pressure of surviving politics. Even geniuses had their stress-induced chaos. Then there's Henry VIII of England. Yes, the king who reshaped England with his divorces, his wives, and let's be honest, his ego. Henry started as a Renaissance prince, handsome, athletic, educated, but obsession over a male heir quickly drove him into tyrannical behavior. He executed 2 of his 6 wives, and the others were forced into exile or terrifyingly awkward situations. Every morning must have been a mix of what will I do today and how can I avoid scandal while asserting absolute authority. Dysfunction writ large with jewels and crowns. His daughter Elizabeth I inherited some of the same family dysfunction. The Virgin Queen managed to rule effectively, but her early life was a nightmare of parental betrayal. She grew up watching her mother executed and her father's whims decide her future. Dysfunction became second nature, a survival skill she wielded expertly in politics. By the time she sat on the throne, Elizabeth had transformed personal trauma into calculated rule, surrounded by advisors who constantly schemed, much like her predecessors. Across the Alps, we find Francis I of France, patron of Leonardo da Vinci. Charming, flamboyant, obsessed with art and culture. But personally, not great at decision-making. His endless wars with Charles V of Spain drained France's coffers. His court loved splendor, but his subjects sometimes starved. Francis's life demonstrates another pattern. Dysfunction wasn't always cruel or violent. Sometimes it was indulgent, extravagant, and just slightly negligent. Meanwhile, in Italy, Cesare Borgia made history as the ultimate Renaissance schemer. Son of Pope Alexander VI, he was ruthless, ambitious, and cunning. He plotted, poisoned, and manipulated with almost surgical precision. His story feels like a thriller, yet it's also bedtime story sleepy when you think about it slowly.
a young man navigating politics, ambition, and family rivalry in a world obsessed with appearances. Dysfunction, velvet-robed and calculated. And let's not forget Isabella d'Este, a Renaissance duchess whose life reminds us that dysfunction wasn't limited to men. She skillfully navigated court intrigues, art patronage, and marriage alliances. Her husband, Francesco II Gonzaga, was charming but often negligent. Isabella's letters reveal frustration, cleverness, and determination, a woman managing dysfunction with grace. In Spain, Philip II provides another case, king of an empire so vast it spanned continents. Yet, personally, Philip was melancholy, suspicious, and controlling. His obsession with order led to paranoia, mistreatment of subordinates, and the rigid imposition of Catholic orthodoxy. Dysfunction in Philip's life was subtle, pervasive, and often chillingly bureaucratic. Even cultural icons weren't immune. Catherine de' Medici of France, widow, regent, manipulator, masterfully used intrigue, rumor, and political alliances to maintain power. Behind sumptuous banquets and courtly entertainments were plots, poisonings, and manipulation. Dysfunction, often polite, well-dressed, and deadly effective. The Renaissance also brought obsession with legacy. Monarchs, dukes, and princes commissioned portraits, palaces, and artworks to cement their memory. Yet the people behind the art often had lives full of insecurity, betrayal, illness, and paranoia. Behind the velvet, dysfunction persisted. By the end of the Renaissance, European courts had perfected the art of human chaos. Gold-plated dysfunction. Clever, cruel, creative, and sometimes compassionate, but always, always human. Perhaps that's the final takeaway. No matter the era, the trappings, or the genius, royals were often just people with flaws magnified by power. So, as we drift toward the end of our bedtime journey through dysfunction, we leave a world of crowns, thrones, and velvet halls. From Mesopotamia to Renaissance Europe, the story remains the same. Kings and queens, emperors and maharajas, pharaohs and sultans, imperfect humans in glittering armor, struggling, scheming, and occasionally spectacularly failing. Sleep now, gentle listener. The dynasties will survive without you tonight. And somewhere in history, another royal is undoubtedly making the same mistakes, with slightly better robes and far worse advisors. Hey again. If you've made it this far, congratulations. You floated through pharaohs, emperors, maharajas, and medieval kings. Now, let's drift gently into Renaissance Europe, where the art was beautiful, the architecture breathtaking, and the royal scandals sometimes deadly. We'll start with Lorenzo de' Medici, the Magnificent, Florence's golden boy, patron of the arts, lover of poetry and sculpture. A brilliant mind, but also a man deeply entangled in political intrigue. Lorenzo had to balance factions, bribe allies, and occasionally dodge assassination attempts. Dysfunction here isn't about personal failings as much as the sheer pressure of surviving politics. Even geniuses had their stress-induced chaos. Then there's Henry VIII of England. Yes, the king who reshaped England with his divorces, his wives, and let's be honest, his ego. Henry started as a Renaissance prince, handsome, athletic, educated, but obsession over a male heir quickly drove him into tyrannical behavior. He executed 2 of his 6 wives, and the others were forced into exile or terrifyingly awkward situations. Every morning must have been a mix of what will I do today and how can I avoid scandal while asserting absolute authority. Dysfunction writ large with jewels and crowns. His daughter Elizabeth I inherited some of the same family dysfunction. The Virgin Queen managed to rule effectively, but her early life was a nightmare of parental betrayal. She grew up watching her mother executed and her father's whims decide her future. Dysfunction became second nature, a survival skill she wielded expertly in politics. By the time she sat on the throne, Elizabeth had transformed personal trauma into calculated rule, surrounded by advisors who constantly schemed, much like her predecessors. Across the Alps, we find Francis I of France, patron of Leonardo da Vinci. Charming, flamboyant, obsessed with art and culture. But personally, not great at decision-making. His endless wars with Charles V of Spain drained France's coffers. His court loved splendor, but his subjects sometimes starved. Francis's life demonstrates another pattern. Dysfunction wasn't always cruel or violent. Sometimes it was indulgent, extravagant, and just slightly negligent. Meanwhile, in Italy, Caesar Borgia made history as the ultimate Renaissance schemer. Son of Pope Alexander VI, he was ruthless, ambitious, and cunning. He plotted, poisoned, and manipulated with almost surgical precision. His story feels like a thriller, yet it's also bedtime story sleepy when you think about it slowly. A young man navigating politics, ambition, and family rivalry in a world obsessed with appearances. Dysfunction, velvet-robed and calculated. And let's not forget Isabella d'Este, a Renaissance duchess whose life reminds us that dysfunction wasn't limited to men. She skillfully navigated court intrigues, art patronage, and marriage alliances. Her husband, Francesco II Gonzaga, was charming but often negligent. Isabella's letters reveal frustration, cleverness, and determination, a woman managing dysfunction with grace. In Spain, Philip II provides another case, king of an empire so vast it spanned continents. Yet, personally, Philip was melancholy, suspicious, and controlling. His obsession with order led to paranoia, mistreatment of subordinates, and the rigid imposition of Catholic orthodoxy. Dysfunction in Philip's life was subtle, pervasive, and often chillingly bureaucratic. Even cultural icons weren't immune. Catherine de' Medici of France, widow, regent, manipulator, masterfully used intrigue, rumor, and political alliances to maintain power. Behind sumptuous banquets and courtly entertainments were plots, poisonings, and manipulation. Dysfunction, often polite, well-dressed, and deadly effective. The Renaissance also brought obsession with legacy. Monarchs, dukes, and princes commissioned portraits, palaces, and artworks to cement their memory. Yet the people behind the art often had lives full of insecurity, betrayal, illness, and paranoia. Behind the velvet, dysfunction persisted. By the end of the Renaissance, European courts had perfected the art of human chaos. Gold-plated dysfunction. Clever, cruel, creative, and sometimes compassionate, but always, always human. Perhaps that's the final takeaway. No matter the era, the trappings, or the genius, royals were often just people with flaws magnified by power. So, as we drift toward the end of our bedtime journey through dysfunction, we leave a world of crowns, thrones, and velvet halls. From Mesopotamia to Renaissance Europe, the story remains the same. Kings and queens, emperors and maharajas, pharaohs and sultans, imperfect humans in glittering armor, struggling, scheming, and occasionally spectacularly failing. Sleep now, gentle listener. The dynasties will survive without you tonight. And somewhere in history, another royal is undoubtedly making the same mistakes, with slightly better robes and far worse advisors.